Today on AI Actually, AgentOps, why keeping AI agents running is harder than building them.
The agent ops is the responsibility you have to these digital employees that you are now deploying across your enterprise.
Building the agents is one thing, but keeping them performing is another thing.
It might be a network problem, it might be a server problem, it might be whatever, gremlins in the machine. You got to go Fonzie the machine and get it back up and running.
So that to me is the meeting of business and IT and AI. You need all of those skills to deliver agentic ops.
Okay, Jim Johnson here, back in the hot seat, hosting today for our AI podcast, AI Actually. I think we're at the end of the year. We're at the end of our rope. This is sort of it. But as I understand it, we won't be sharing this until the new year. In either case, happy end of the year, happy new year. You know, I've got Joey here, Nicole, Stu, all of us have been to some extent or another on many of these podcasts this year. This is our 12th. Hard to believe. We're now up to 7 viewers, which is awesome. But we, today we're going to get sort of focused on a topic that is coming up repeatedly, and it's maybe unsurprising given the maturity curve that's out there. Agents, we've talked about that all year, and it's going to be a conversation next year. And Karpathy says it's the decade of agents. I've said this more than once that AI at the enterprise, with business, with getting value, should be about getting work done. And that's awesome. And agents are one of the most important paths to leveraging AI to get work done. But I think it presents sort of a new issue or new set of issues when we have agents, quote, in production and doing work for us. If we want to think of them like digital workers, that's fine. It's not a one-to-one correlation. We've talked about that many times. This is about doing more work, not replacing work necessarily. But I think we need to sort of define what is, we call it agent ops here. But what is it? What are some of the challenges? What are we seeing? What do companies need to think about? So I want to go around, just kick things off and go around the horn with the crew here and try to define it. What is agent ops? What does that mean to us? And then we'll unpack it as we go here. And I think there are some things to debate about it. It's awesome. I'll tee it up. Nicole, I'm going to spin it to you first.
Sure.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, happily. So I read somewhere, I'm not exactly sure where to attribute it, but I really like this framing. Agentic operations is really the difference between AI agents as a demo versus as a durable business capacity. I think or capability, I should say. I think that really frames it nicely. And the things that we look for in agentic operations are, what are the changes over time? Once you bring an agent to life, you have a group of users that you're working with. This group of users asks a set of questions. They have a specific target business objective that they're trying to accomplish. Then let's say next month, you bring in a new set of users that have a different perspective. The way that they're going to use that agent, they're going to start asking not only different questions that actually have slightly different spin on the business objective, but they'll ask it differently. So agentic operations watches this behavior and notices that maybe the agent isn't answering questions quite as directly or as accurately or with the most important information prioritized as it did for the original person is using the agent. And I think agentic operations are the team members that come in and shore that up, make sure that the agent continues to behave at optimum business value.
Okay. Joey, what's your take? What is it?
Well, Jim, I don't know. I might be the least technical person on this call. Definitely,
That's terrifying given that I'm here, but go ahead.
I was going to say outside of you, but I just, I was trying to be a little respectful. Listen, I think when I think about agent ops, first off, it's new, right? It's a new concept. And when I'm talking to customers, I try to put it in terms that they would understand. And I think that as most businesses, you have a responsibility when you hire humans to bring them along and to upskill them and to make sure that they're staying on task and to make sure that they're doing things correctly and as expected. I mean, unless you're the CEO of a company and you don't have a board over you, then you have some sort of manager that's helping you along the way, especially when you're first hired. So I always try to put it into those terms. The agent ops is the responsibility you have to these digital employees that you are now deploying across your enterprise or your company, whatever size it might be. The issue with it is, again, going back to it's new, and people try to think of it through the lens of software or through the lens of LLMs are easy to use from a consumer perspective when you think about ChatGPT and Claude and all the things that we use every day. So why would I have to keep making this thing better? Shouldn't it just get better on its own? There's all this FUD that is in the market of making it seem like agent ops is something that you don't need. So these things should be self-learning or it should all be automated. I mean, even on a call earlier this week, and I'm sorry to get into that because we're in the description and definition phase, but just one example of where I see this is someone said, we updated a prompt to follow a rule. Every single time when you ask a question on a specific analysis flow, we were seeing some behavior where the agent wasn't pulling the data right, even though the data was there. So we had to go back in and add the context and add some prompting. And there was someone on the call, an IT representative, who said, why isn't that automated? And it was just, it's funny because it goes back into the whole concept of the easy button that if you heard me on the first episode, the 7 listeners, like Jim mentioned at the beginning, I was talking about the easy button. And this is part of the problem with the easy button. It should be easy to use. It should be easy to deploy. It should be easy to manage. And while it's not hard, again, it just goes back into a lack of skills to do that across the enterprise. So talked a lot. To sum it up, I think it's agent ops is the responsibility that companies have to deploy digital employees across the business and to make sure they're staying on task and making sure they're doing the work that you deployed them to get done.
Stu, what's your take?
I mean, let's start with the definition. I think most folks on the technology side, at least, are very familiar with the term DevOps or LiveOps as kind of the processing capability of monitoring a system post live for failures, out of band events, things along those lines. And every once in a while, technology is going to have a problem. It might be a network problem, might be a server problem, it might be whatever, gremlins in the machine. You got to go Fonzie the machine and get it back up and running. And, usually there's a live ops group or a DevOps group that is monitoring any sort of live service around that. I think so. The question is agent ops just, live ops when there's an agent? And in a way there is, but I think that undersells the great degree of added complexity that comes into play, right? Because, throughout most of our careers, at least, these technical systems have been largely deterministic, right? It doesn't mean that there weren't lots of places for unexpected failures, but usually those were something broke somewhere along the process or didn't behave in exactly the way we expected. But when I ask an LLM a question, it's it's statistical what answer I get back, and that's the simplest level of a single turn to a non-reasoning LLM, right? The type of LLMs we had a year ago, where I would ask a question and every time I'm going to get a slightly different answer back. The agents are way more complex than that, especially as the technologies progress through this year. And we can, whatever the right term, I can actually talk about how I feel like there's 3 levels of agents, 3 levels of opportunity for these agents to fall off of the wagon, which I'll call drift, which Nicole hates that word, so maybe I'll call it drift a lot more. I don't know. And then we have and then the third level is kind of almost 3 levels of this operational control over it, right? Where you just, as these systems become more and more complex, the ways that you have to monitor for failure are more and more complex. So I think it's an emerging discipline. That's the next evolution of DevOps or LiveOps, but requires a different level of work and different type of work than people that have done that type of role in the past are accustomed to.
So Nicole, go ahead.
I know you haven't had a chance to go yet, Jim, and I'm just going to leapfrog back in.
All the time in the hours.
I just want to say, I think those were great thoughts from both of you, and we'll talk about drift later. But I think it's important to bring together a couple of things. There is absolutely an automated evaluation component to AgentOps as well as a human component to AgentOps. And I
100%.
think it's important for us to acknowledge that there is some automation that can and should be done to monitor the performance of an agent. But there's also a human in the loop who is deeply knowledgeable of those business objectives, who understands the users, who understands what a good answer is to a question, and is watching for those changes, for those changing user behaviors or changing model behaviors over time. So I just wanted to add, I think it's important to acknowledge that for Agentic Ops, there's an automated component and a human component that goes together. Sorry, Jen.
I can't go much further, though, without acknowledging the concept of Fonzie the machine. There might be 1 in 100 listeners, and we don't have 100, we only have 7, who will know what that is. And I've never heard that before, but I was able to figure out what it is. So I'm very excited about that. I'm going to add that to my own vernacular right now, to Fonzie the machine. This is thrilling for me.
If you understand it, in the club.
Yeah, I know. I like it. I like the definition. This argument over drift. But the question is why? Let me steer it this way. Why would the performance of an agent degrade in any way? And why is that somehow different than classic system support? Like, I have my own opinion here, but I want to get everyone's, and then I'll tell you what's right. But just, what's different? Why is this thing going to not perform the way it should over time, or what other factors are involved that are unusual or new?
Yeah.
Who wants to go?
I'll go first, just so that, because Stu's smarter than me, so I'll let him go second. So the reason I don't like the term drift for this is I think there are very specific reasons that performance is perceived to change over time. I think you can have things like a new group of personas come in. That new group of personas, those new users who have a different perspective on the business, are going to ask a different set of questions. That's not necessarily a drift in behavior. It's just a different perspective that needs to be injected into the context of the agent.
One could argue if you're not close to all this, that you just didn't test it yet.
And I think Stu was talking about deterministic versus probabilistic as well. And I think, you when you have users interacting against a probabilistic system, you can test so much, but you still need to account for differences in human behavior. So I think there's the probabilistic versus deterministic, and also the human in the loop interjects with what's a good answer, what's a bad answer. And they need to be able to model, update their context to handle those differences.
Okay. Joey, what's your take?
Well, again, I always try to bring it back to consumer sort of talk, right? And thinking about using LLMs in my everyday. And I think everybody's sat there and Fonzied the machine with a Chat GPT or a Claude when you're trying to get it to write a proposal, and it might take your words too literally, or there's something that maybe you gave it an example of, hey, I want you to do it like this, and it does it exactly like that, but it didn't take in the context of what you're trying to get it to do. And that's outside of the world of analytics, right? So you take a model that behaves like that and you put it to answer, enterprise analytics questions. And let's just say you have it on one single data set and you have it on maybe one market. If you're global enterprise, you're looking at your market. Maybe it's in the UK, or you're in the US, or you're in Brazil, but each individual market is going to ask questions differently, even on that same data set. Each language that they ask is going to behave a little bit differently from an interpretation perspective. And now that model is sitting there and it's been set up and configured on maybe one of these markets, maybe all of these markets, who knows, but it's trying to interpret your question and then pick the right tool to go and query a database. And that's a single database. Now you add in multiple databases, you put in disparate databases, you added more markets. Now go back to the beginning where we're just trying to get it to write a proposal in the right language using a single document, and it can't do it each time, right? So when you're working with tools like this, you have to have someone there that is observing it, is observing any feedback it gets, and you don't want that to be automated. And I think that's, again, where customers wonder, why do we need agent ops? Why can't it be self-learning? But if it learns from Brazil and goes and applies that globally in every single one of your markets, you've got a huge problem. And that's not going to lend itself well to a scalable enterprise solution without those those agent ops sort of managers there to support this and to continue just to continue scaling it and making it better. So again, I'm trying to just put it into sort of some everyday context how we use the models.
Stu, I know I should turn to you, but I want to jump in on one thing. In sort of classic software customer success stories, there was the user, the buyer of the software, and there was the originator or software owner, sort of a two-party system. And that originator might be, might be your organization within your own company that wrote and created something custom. You might be buying a SaaS service from some kind of vendor. And I think those relationships still exist, but there's a third party at the table here now, and that is the owner of the intelligence. And what we're creating with agents or intelligent applications in this sort of non-deterministic, probabilistic world we keep talking about is fundamentally some level of decision making. And that decision making has a certain variability to it. That's the probabilistic point. But there's a third party in this game now, and that's the owner of the large language model that is the intelligence that's inserted into whatever we're trying to do here. And they are the owner of that intelligence. And from time to time, they can make changes to that intelligence, and that will cause it tomorrow to react or to act differently, even with the same set of inputs, the same user questions or the same user usage or the same API relationship. Somebody else is at the table right now, and they might have, they didn't necessarily go from version 3 to version 4. They might have just corrected in some weights in the model under the covers, and that will create, that to me is sort of where drift comes from. They made a change. We weren't necessarily party to it. We, the creator of the solution, or the client, the customer of the solution, and things can change as a result of that. We have some conspiracy theories even about changes to models by large language model providers. We'll drift into conspiracy theories in a few minutes. And Nicole, she and the sort of the Kennedy assassination and what the large language model providers do, but they can change the solution. There's a third party at the table, and everybody needs to recognize that they're not in complete control here. Enormous value, enormous ROI, enormous potential, but there's more players at the table. Sorry, Stu, your turn here.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything everyone said. I think we joke about Nicole and I having different opinions on drift. It is probably just what we define as drift. Fundamentally, I kind of think of drift as the system is becoming something different than you thought you deployed. So you tested it through a bunch of scenarios prior, and now maybe even rerun those same scenarios post deployment, and it's operating differently. Right now, that could be that it's operating differently just because of this non-probabilistic nature, or it could be that, 1 out of 100 times when I give this prompt, I'm going to get a weird answer, just based off of the statistical distribution of the types of answers I'll get. It could be something like that. It could be but it's more often, I think, from changes that are happening in the environment, right? So I think, which can also be changes under the hood by the model providers themselves, right? That OpenAI or Anthropic or Google or someone has made some sort of subtle change in the model. But I think of drift as actually, the interesting thing here is a lot of what we talked about is the problems you have with what I call level A agents, right? In my mind, there's 3 levels of agents that you can have. And the first level is around using LLMs to automate a workflow. And and that's can still be very complex agents, because you can be having multiple steps, but the steps are largely defined. And an LLM has a job to do at each start of the process or at each part of the workflow, but you've tried to engineer that workflow as much as you possibly can. Level 2 gets into more where the agent is more goal directed, meaning like, I need you to accomplish this goal, and the agent kind of decides how to accomplish the goal, right? And then level 3 is actually when you have multiple agents coordinating with each other inside of a system in order to accomplish goals. Everything we talked about is hard at that first level. The complexity rises even more as we go to the additional levels. And so And I think there's actually, and I talked about there being 2 levels at level 1. Level 1 was 1A is when you're using a non-reasoning model as, during the steps of the workflow where you need agentic help. Level 1B is actually when you're using a reasoning model to do this. And that introduces its own complications. And it gets, really deep. I can bore everyone to death. But I kind of look at 3 levels of drift that have created that you need to then start to manage from this. One is kind of what Jim was starting to talk about, and it also flows a little bit, into some of the stuff Joey was talking about, which is model drift. But model drift is when I make a prompt, right? I prompted the model and I'm getting a different response than we had tested, than we expected. And that can happen for a lot of reasons which we've kind of talked about, right? The underlying model can change. The Joey's example with Brazil, right? Like we make a change that was more related to Brazil, but now it's kind of propagated out into other places. The system's kind of learned the wrong things. The world that the model lives in, the workflow that it's deployed in has changed in subtle ways. That kind of goes into model drift is how I would call it. The next type of drift, though, is kind of started to emerge as you get into these reasoning models, which is behavioral drift. Right. And so with these reasoning models, you make one prompt, but the model itself is doing multiple turns before it comes back to an answer. That actually introduces all sorts of additional opportunities for error. Right. So the model
wings problem, like you get a little bit in step 1 and now you're going, and it sort of magnifies itself.
Absolutely. As you get this complexity, you can definitely get the butterfly flapped its wings in China and then my weather changed in Boise 10 days later, right? I mean, it's small changes can amplify themselves because, if in step 1 of my agentic flow, the reasoning process breaks down to some level, then that actually compounds, right? As I go through now 10, 20, 50, 60, 70, and a lot of more difficult agentic flows right now, it's not that uncommon to go through, 60, 70, 80 turns in order to get it done, right? If you're trying to really accomplish something really big, if not even more than that. And so problems amplify themselves along the way. And these reasoning things introduce another problem, like the amount that the model is going to reason depends on everything that's happened prior. And, so in other words, like a good example that probably everyone's experienced at some level, you're having a nice long conversation with ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, and you're really in the groove and you're jamming and it's going to be great. And then all of a sudden it rushes to an answer and it gives you something, right? That's because these models panic when they're close to running out of context, right? And so, which, context is, think of it as this, the amount of in-process memory effectively that the agent has to work from. And at the beginning of a conversation, especially with these new models, it has lots of context and it can go, and then it's kind of like, oh God, I'm done. Like I've run out of budget. Right. And it can be, and the systems are starting to evolve too, where there's literally more of a little bit of a budget allocated to these calls. And so it can literally just be, hey, I've run out of the compute budget I had available to me. And so that's this behavioral drift is I might be getting different behavior from time to time because of small changes in the reasoning logic or other pieces like that. And then you can start to get agentic drift. And again, especially as you get these more goal-driven agents that are making their own plan, choosing how they attack the problem. Well, they then maybe they made, each time they're making a slightly different plan. They tend to call tools, right? Well, maybe there's been a change in not in the model, in the prompt, not in whatever, but in the tool itself and how the tool operates. So all of these or we add one more tool and now it chooses the wrong tool, right? Because now you've given it a choice of more tools. it's more likely to choose the wrong tool in some situations. So anyways, there's these different levels of complexity, I think. And I don't know that people have to necessarily understand all of the details of all the, there's 3 different levels of agents and 3 different levels of drift and whatever. I think the meta point to take home is it's a different level of challenge that we have to deal with in terms of how we monitor it, validate it, and ensure that it's working in the ways we expect.
I heard somebody say something really catchy just a day or two ago, which is there's not sort of a blue screen of death obviousness to these things. It can be quite subtle, and making this job the responsibility, classically support for a production system fell to IT. At some point, they may go through a triaging. Oh, we need second level support, or we need third level support. And at some point, they may call somebody on the business side, if necessary, to help understand it. This is sort of a different game. You didn't get a blue screen of death. You didn't get a SOC 7. You didn't get there's not sort of a overt kind of error message necessarily popping up. And it feels like it requires a different set of skill sets to be brought to the table. Can we talk about that just a little bit? Because I think it's a huge organizational challenge for companies to figure out. They're sort of doing it. Yeah, that's challenging, and we've just talked about that. But who even owns this in an organization, and how do you design an organization to do this? I think it's a big problem right now. Thoughts on that?
I want to add to that. I think that's a great point, Jim. I think one of the points Joey was making, he said that when you move to different markets, you move from Brazil to Germany or something like that, and the business looks at these different markets differently. I always like to say, if you have to train the users, you've actually failed at your job of building good context. So I think that brings us back to what skills do you need to do agentic operations? You need to be deeply knowledgeable of the customer's business objectives. That is the number one thing. But you also need to be knowledgeable. What does that agent do? What are its capabilities? What are its limitations? You also need to understand the framework in which it works. So that includes things like, what is the LLM doing? What part does that play in this? So that to me is the meeting of business and IT and AI. You need all of those skills to deliver agentic ops effectively to make sure, and as you measure the agent's success, this agentic ops team is looking at not just how many users are in the system, but how effective are the answers that the users are getting? Are we seeing a drop off? Are people not returning because these new users are asking questions differently and we're not answering them as well? I think it's that intersection that really helps to keep those answers in the right realm of delivering value and keep users coming back.
Organizationally, especially in larger companies, those skills, albeit very deep, tend to exist in different people and potentially in organizations that are far from one another. Small company actually may be easier to bring them together. Any thoughts on that, or am I off base with that? I think anytime we as an organization, Answer Rocket, anytime we introduce the idea of agentic powered solutions or AI powered solutions or LLM powered solutions, whatever you want to say, intelligent solutions, we now make it sort of a standard obligation on our part to have a conversation about this very early in the journey, because otherwise clients can be surprised by it. But I don't know that the answer is quite easy. I agree with Nicole's point. You got to have all these skills to do this well. And I agree with Stu's point, the level of complexity and the opportunity for the problem to be compounding, et cetera, depending on the agentic design. But man, bringing all those skills together just to watch what's going on is a challenge. Thoughts?
Some thoughts I have on just the original question, and I think it sort of intertwines what you just said a little bit there, Jim. Listen, if the business teams, if you're telling me that IT is going to be agent ops or keep these sort of up and running, your business teams are going to lose faith in the project. They don't want IT to manage these agents, first and foremost. The agent ops person, there's two options, right? They either need to live on the individual teams in a role that's similar to A lot of enterprises that I've worked with over the past several years, a lot of them have built-in analysts on their teams that are actually part of those specific business teams. They don't report up to an analytics person per se. They report into those business units, and they are their resource for analysis. Has to be somebody like that, sits on the end of the row if you're in person, right? Or someone that is on your team and you have access to them to answer your specific questions. But in this case, that person would be helping to keep these agents up and running. And the reason being, if you put AI initiatives are revenue generating initiatives, and if you don't see it that way, then you're not thinking about it correctly. And if you put agent ops in IT, a traditional cost center, then you're obviously not aligning it with the ROI here. The ROI is in those business centers. The ROI is on the business teams. And the only people that understand that fully are those business people, right? So you go and say IT is going to help, then I think there's a lot of fear. Again, going back to a customer where they're like, I don't want IT to manage this. I don't want IT to build this. Even if they build a really good prototype, I don't want that because now I'm relying on IT, who traditionally has delivered nothing for me that I have deemed to be valuable. And I hear that all over the place.
Back
So
on your
like
thoughts on
listening
IT.
to this, sorry if
I
I
love
was.
it.
That's what I hear everywhere. That's what your business teams are saying, not me. I'm just regurgitating what I've heard.
Stu, what do you think? I mean, to me, somewhere buried in this is there's something new here in the age of the deep generalist. And I don't know that I'm characterizing that correctly, but what are your thoughts?
I think, first let's go back to what's different from the traditional systems, right? And I think traditional systems tended to be a little more task driven, input, yield output, and the outputs tended to be highly verifiable, right? It did what it was supposed to do, or it didn't.
And you could most every line of the code if you wanted to or needed to in classic unit testing fashion.
Yeah, and that's how, traditional systems started to work. Now, we're all accustomed to work that's not quite that way. It's just usually been done by humans, okay? And so, where
Right.
we're evolving to with these agents is they're in a much more goal driven versus task driven, right? And then the outcomes based off of the things we're asking them to do, the outcomes are often verifiable, and that's great when they're verifiable, and you can set up systems to verify it and monitor and do whatever. But sometimes they're more squishy, right? Which again, certain people in your organization are very familiar with. Those tend to be your supervisors, your managers, your HR staff, your quality inspection staff, right? In terms of like so I'll just run an example. Let's say my goal is create a 20 slide deck around this topic, and I send an agent off to do this goal. Well, that's similar if I sent, the four of us off to do that. I know Nicole's going to come back with the highest quality deck because she's got, or Joey, one of those two. They're awesome at this stuff. I'm more at the like stick figure level when I actually have to put together a slide deck. You know what I mean? There might be some good thoughts in there, but it's going to be poorly organized. So you can't say success is I created a 20 slide deck. You have to say success is I created a 20 slide deck that didn't suck. You know what I mean? That reached some sort of overall standard that we have in our organization. And that's what we expect of our employees as well. And, with employees and with the quality inspection, which, there's other areas where we're used to like squishiness, right? Like I was in video games for a long time. Well, this is, you can do something and it works, but is it good? Is it, it's like, how do you judge art, right? Like, is this good art or bad art or whatever, right? You have to have a little bit of taste, becomes actually a critical skill in here. Like, what is actually good? A little bit of, and then some things you can get down, but the measurement system's a little more complicated. Like with this 20 slide deck problem, maybe what you wind up coming around to is like more of a more sophisticated rubric, right? Where you say like, oh, okay, here's 30 criteria we like to judge around. And how does it do on each of these 30 criteria? And you get a score, right? So I think which you tend to do in employee management or quality management as well, right? Where these things are squishy, but you've got to develop some sort of repeatable system or you can't scale. Those same type of approaches we are used to doing with human outputs with humans judging the outputs when they're goal oriented. We just have to start thinking about how do we do that with agents.
But I think that concept is much always original point, because we're going way back early in this conversation, which is we're thinking about this work, and I think you just sort of said it, as more equivalent to human output and needs to have that type of human supervisory activity. The things you just described, the quality aspect of it is not necessarily an IT did the software run, did it sort of, it didn't throw an error code. This sort of flips the script, which says at the highest level, the monitoring and management of this agent really needs to be based on the business goal, not based on the sort of IT technology execution. That's part of it at some level for sure. But we're sort of saying the business owner of the agent really needs to be the first level owner of management and monitoring potentially.
Jim, it goes back to, if I asked you quickly, what's an agent?
To me, it's a digital worker doing something that is valuable work.
Yeah.
And that would typically line up with what the business is trying to do. IT, in essence, to me, is sort of a support function for helping enable and deliver that, but it doesn't monitor what marketing's doing, or it doesn't monitor what finance is doing, or it doesn't, or what's going on with the supply chain. It starts over there. And now we're talking about, again, I'm careful not to get into this, an agent equals a human, because I don't think that's the case at all.
Yeah.
That's a whole other discussion. But it should be supporting the functional work that we're trying to get done.
And it's simply, and you say this all the time, agent is something that gets work done, right? Like it gets work done. And if you're not getting valuable work done, you're going to get fired. But if you're building an agent, you want it to get valuable work done.
But you just hit on it, valuable work. And I think that goes to Stu's point.
100%.
That word valuable goes to Stu's point about the goal. And I like your point, Stu, about taste and some judgment. Was it a good I mean, yeah, we can judge. Did it create 20 slides? Fine. But were they good? Were they useful? Or did you need to send your new analyst to go back, give them some guidance, and recreate the deck? We're sort of in that same place now, except.
Yeah. And the reality is, it can't scale unless you systemize it in some degree, right? And large corporations actually, in some ways, have an advantage here because they're used to that, right? If you have 100,000 employees and you're McDonald's, you're trying to figure, right? You've always had these employees with goals and whatever, and you're trying to figure out, like, how do I systemize, this very complex problem of dealing with humans where everyone behaves differently, but I'm trying to achieve common goals. So I think you've got to systemize it. You have to audit. You can't have humans touching all of this stuff all the time necessarily, or you're going to lose some of the benefits or just be unable to scale practically for certain problems. I think you've got to figure out how to systemize it. But I think you come back to, when you try to systemize it, you come back to things like, I'm going to develop a rubric, and then I'm going to have another agent whose job is to score the rubric. Right. Yeah. And we drive that to be good. Or then someone has to monitor that it doesn't have drift. Right. And it'll have to score it. But these are,
solvable.
It is the way companies have scaled in the past with humans. It's a lot of that comes into bear as well. That's actually why I think if you go from LiveOps to AgentOps, I think you're going to have a next level, which is going to be cognitive ops, which is like, how is this thing actually thinking about the problems and driving that? And that's going to take even a whole other level. But, that's what we'll be talking about going into.
In the new year, we'll get cognitive ops knocked down. So, okay. Yeah. Guys, you know what? What's interesting to me about this, I said it might be 15 minutes, it might be 45 minutes. We're past that, and I have a feeling we could just keep going because this is a challenging topic. And building the agents is one thing, but keeping them performing is another thing. And I think what's interesting about again, I said it before, we have an obligation to talk. We're in the client service business. We have an obligation to talk to clients and customers about this and help bring them along. So great discussion. I appreciate everyone here at the end of the week before the holidays. I know folks won't see this till the new year, but thanks so much. Let's put a pin in this one, and this will be a hot topic, I know, as we go into the new year. So thank you for being here.
Thanks, team.
See y'all.